We'll just fast forward to where we stopped. Remember, I had entitled this section, which we will continue, something about Dionysus, and the something about Dionysus we will be pursuing at some length. So, I briefly introduced you to Dionysus. In the cult, there's no cult statue per se. Well, there are, but originally the cult statue of Dionysus was a mask affixed to a tree with a chiton draped around the trunk of the tree. And you can see this clearly in this vase. It's a ritual. This literally shows the statue, quote unquote, the mask, the tree, the chiton, and an offering table with offerings, undoubtedly wine, but other offerings as well to Dionysus. And chiton is the form of dress.
How do you spell it?
Citon or Chiton. It depends on which transliteration. The chiton is actually mostly known as a female dress, but it was also a formal dress for people singing as well. So you see Apollo with the chiton and Dionysus and charioteers with a kind of chiton. Okay, so masks. Something to do with Dionysus, and here's the muse of drama from the Hermitage. I pointed out she's missing her high heels or her big shoes because the bottom part is a reconstruction. And we stopped at the Pronomos vase. Now, this vase, which is not on display but lives in the storerooms of the National Museum in Naples, was taken off of display because people suspect that it shattered into too many pieces during the earthquake. So they're pretending it's okay, but probably isn't okay. So these are some drawings from it. And what's important about it is what it shows is after the theatrical production. And it's called the Pronomos vase because all the principals are named, all the participants in the production, including the musician, who was a well-known late classical musician by the name of Pronomos. There's a photograph of this vase, which may or may not exist in this form anymore. And there's a book about it, a recent conference with all the conference papers and loads of photographs and drawings published. And here's a flattening out of the vase so you could see a part of the story. I believe this is Mr. Pronomos himself. And in the center is the marriage of Dionysus and Ariadne. And we were really focusing on the tripod. The tripod is the gift of victory once this is the other side of the Pronomos vase. The victorious team gets the right to set up a tripod near the theater, or at the entrance of the theater. And so that's why you see a number of tripods. Anyways, this is pretty much it for representing all the elements of a drama. The satyrs belong to the satyr play. That is usually after the catharsis of a tragedy, a satyr play is performed, a kind of farce. Here are two of the principal actors. This guy is playing Heracles, you can tell from his pelt. He's the older Heracles, here's the younger Heracles. You know how Heracles died, don't you?
Yeah.
Terribly.
Poisoned,
His wife gave him a poison cloak, and to stop the pain, he has to be placed on a funerary pyre. So, we do have images of comedies with the stage, and here's an example, sort of in side view. You can see a wooden stage, steps leading up to the stage, some props, and a little bit of a lean-to. And this, by the way, is a comedy where you see these two people represent a centaur. And we have this one fragment of a vase painted, which shows the staging, or the scenai, as where a word for scene comes from, the stage of a tragedy, one corner of it. And here's a close-up in black and white. And that's what we're going to look at in some detail, the archaeology of what we know of the earliest theaters and why it's important for people interested in painting. So, the very earliest theater was sited south of the Acropolis. This is a drawing which represents the state of the Acropolis before it was burned by the Persians after Thermopylae, but before Salamis in the Second Persian War in 480 BC. The predecessor to the Parthenon was under construction. That was the dedication to the victory of Marathon 10 years earlier. And there's the old Athena temple. And I was present when this drawing was made, believe it or not. And we decided to represent the earliest form of the stage in the conventional fashion because it would have been a little too controversial to show what it was more likely to have looked like. So that's what we're going to see the evidence for. This is much more likely. Ignore this altar. There's the Temple of Dionysus, the altar in front of it, some kind of retaining wall, a terrace, and a rectangular orchestra, although probably trapezoidal rather than rectangular, with wooden seating. Here's a better reconstruction, a model of the same, that represents the earliest theater of Dionysus. Now for dates, we're talking around basically between 500 and 450 BC. So when drama was emerging, the first surviving major playwright is, of course, Aeschylus, and then Sophocles in the middle of and latter part of the 5th century, and towards the end of the 5th century, Euripides. So when these earliest great masterpieces of the art of drama were being performed, this is what the theater of Dionysus looked like. Now, there's overwhelming evidence for this, and you'll see some of it. This is the more probable shape of it. This just blocks in the stage, the scenai. This is supposed to be the crane that lifts up the actor who represents the divinity at the end of the drama. And there is evidence on the ground for the trapezoidal form of the stage set. Now, this may or may not shock you. Here's one of the pieces of evidence, the fact that we have blocks for the seating that are rectangular. They're not curved. That's just one piece of evidence. This reconstruction of an early stage set is probably not bad, but the author couldn't resist throwing in a semi-circular, polygonal theatral area for which there is contrary evidence. Now, virtually no vases represent a chorus. This is one of the rare vases which represents a chorus, so that's why I threw it in. And I don't know, how many of you have any background in the emergence of Greek drama? I should then say something. Okay, so this is a late 6th century vase showing a horse race at a major sanctuary. Now, the Greeks assembling on the side of a hill in a kind of familiar form. Probably goes way back. Probably goes back to the Bronze Age. Later on, we'll see evidence of this kind of assembly area for the Bronze Age. But it survived the Dark Ages, and here we see it in the late Archaic, the beginning of the recovery from the long 500-year-long Dark Age. And so, chariot racing and foot racing is the two earliest kinds of competitive activities that happened at Olympia and other major sanctuaries. Now for drama, the two gods that preside over drama are Dionysus, and this is a representation of Apollo. How do you know that this is Apollo? You have the palm tree. Apollo has his laurel wreath. He has his musical instrument, the kithara, and he's dressed for a performance. So here we see a very early stage area in a sanctuary in a very small city in Lato in Crete. And there is the seating area. There's the temple, the orchestra, and the seating area. So how did drama begin? Well, we have a fair idea. There's a photograph of the site. It's quite spectacular. It's on a ridge high up a mountain. The remains of the temple here, and then the theatral area that you just saw right there. Well, there is a small sanctuary of Dionysus outside of Athens on the other side of Mount Hymettus, and the site is called Icaria, and this is probably the origin of the Athenian cult of Dionysus. Later on, these are the remains of a couple of, well, literally remains. Let me show you what the site looks like. Not very much to see above ground. But the remains of a temple, we know there was a statue of Dionysus that was carried in procession from this site all the way to the south slope of the Acropolis, where the major festival was held. And here's a reconstruction of this area. So these are in position. This retaining wall is there. You can see the slope. So you had wooden bleachers set up for the festival. There's the Temple of Dionysus. The statue would be inside here. The statue was really probably no more than a cylinder of wood with a mask attached and a garment draped over it. There's the altar. There's the little retaining wall. And here is the space. And here you see the wagon of Thespis. Basically, drama emerges essentially in this way. Originally, the cult of Dionysus is celebrated by a chorus singing a series of odes to him, and there are 50 people in the chorus. So Thespis is the first person to step out of the chorus. This is the late 6th century BC, and to perform either an aria or a recitation narrating a part of the story as if he was one of the principals in the story. So right at the beginning you have one actor and a chorus, and very quickly by around 500 you then would have three actors playing all the parts, and the chorus was reduced from 50 to 12. And here is a fair reconstruction of the way the stage area at the Sanctuary of Dionysus on the Acropolis looked like towards the end of the 5th century. There's the original temple. A stoa was built up, framing the area of the orchestra. And we have cuttings in the bedrock for some kind of wooden structure. And this is inspired by the little fragment from the painted fragment that I showed you a little bit earlier. Okay, this is probably more realistic. Very small drawings, so I've made it as large as before losing all coherence. So, what is our comparative evidence for Athens? Well, these traces at the Great Theater at Syracuse, what's left of it, and principally this trapezoid on the ground. The Great Theater of Syracuse in Sicily, was originally modeled after the Theater of Dionysus, both in its first and later phase. It's cut into the bedrock, so here you see the later phase, and then below it you see the evidence for the first phase of the theater. There's just some cuttings on the bedrock, and teasing out the remains. This is the probable shape of the first theater at Syracuse, which probably directly reflects, there's a pretty cheesy drawing of the stage, which probably directly reflects the theater of Dionysus in Athens. The most important point about this drawing are the three doors, the central door and the two side doors, and then these two gates at the far end. And there's a close-up of that drawing. Notice how narrow the stage is. This is all backstage, by the way. And this is a stair going down to a tunnel so that some actor can pop up out of the ground in the middle of the orchestra. Okay, now, far more direct evidence for these earliest stages come from Roman wall painting. And this is a three-dimensional imaginative reconstruction of one of these early stages from a fresco on the Palatine in Athens. The House of Augustus, here's a photograph of the central part of the fresco, and this is a three-dimensional recreation of what it would have looked like as one of these early classical stages. And what is in the center of it is a painting of a sanctuary, right here. You see the masks? And the bright colors, this is probably all authentic, probably going back in form to the 5th century. This is a recreation of an ancient stage in Los Angeles at the Getty Villa, the Getty Museum. I don't know if any of you visited the Getty Museum in LA, but they perform dramas in the Great Peristyle, and this is from a recent performance reconstructing one of the early theater buildings. So you have the two side doors and the central door. Okay, and even more evidence from one of the smaller towns outside of Athens. This is Thorikos, an aerial view. Thorikos was a mining town, but it had a major theater. So this represents the earliest form, and then the first phase and the expansion of the theater. So it was cut into the bedrock. There's the temple of Dionysus. Here's the altar, and between the altar and the temple, the rectangular area of the orchestra. Notice there's virtually no evidence of there's no evidence of a masonry stage building. So right through classical times at Thorikos, they continued to have a temporary building for their annual commemoration of Dionysus made of wood. There's just a model of the same. You see the temple, the altar, and the first phase of the 5th century phase of the theater. And even more explicit from this little town, Axione Trachones, outside of Athens. The remains of the orchestra, as you can see here, it's a true rectangle with the foundations of a later Hellenistic stage building. So why am I dwelling on this? History is important. Real evidence is important. Here is the final form of the theater of Dionysus in Athens in the late Roman period. There's the huge indoor theater, the Odeon of Herodes Atticus, set up in the reign of Hadrian. And this was finished in the late Hellenistic period in this form. So, where does the semicircular form of the theater with the circular orchestra begin? Well, we probably have the very first one, remarkably well preserved, and this is the theater at Epidaurus with a circular orchestra. Now, where does most of the drama occur? On the stage, not in the orchestra. If any of you have been to any of these places, especially Epidaurus, they bring the tourists to the center and they ask you to speak, and they're very proud of how well the voice travels. Well, this is a completely fallacious reading of the evidence. The speaking area is the wooden stage building. Some of the singing for major festivals with 50 members of the choir probably went on in the orchestra, but for actual dramas, not very likely. So this is the stage.
So you call it the orchestra, does that mean that there was musical, that's why
No. That's the Greek
just
name
an empty
for
stage.
this space in front of the stage building.
Was there music with these plays?
Oh yes, but not in this world, not in the circular area.
Yeah.
So why is it a circle? Well, probably because of its symbolic intention rather than its acoustic properties. So here we see the theater at Epidaurus in relation to the site of Epidaurus. The sacred area is right here in the center, and the architect of the theater was very likely, the evidence is it was Polycleides the Younger, who may have been a great-grandson of the famous sculptor Polycleides. He's also responsible for the Tholos, the circular building. This is not a terrible digital reconstruction. The forms are okay, the colors are off. Ignore this terrible yellow. Didn't exist. Anyhow, so Polycleides, the same sculptor architect responsible for the round building at Epidaurus and also the great roundish theater. This is a digital reconstruction of the stage building in relation to the theater at Epidaurus. So, what the circular orchestra with the truncated cone of the seating of what will become the traditional area represents the commonality of the audience. And it is probably a reflection of the ideology of these events, rather than anything to do with acoustics or the logic of sound.
Was there any altar there? Was there an altar?
There's no evidence of an altar in the middle here. Nor the temple is way back on the site. It's not right there. Now we have a couple of very well preserved. Now again, when I say well preserved, I mean there are enough pieces there to reconstruct the whole, not that they're all standing there. One of our best preserved theaters is from the town of Priene in Asia Minor. Here's the Temple of Athena at Priene, and a lot of the lower part of this is still in situ. You can see the foundations of the stage building, and what's interesting is the spaces between the columns. So you have the three doors, and you have places for paintings, there, and then three major paintings up here. So the drama is, or the setting of the drama is represented not so much through stage props as through paintings. This is what remains, plus a lot of fragments of the superstructure here, which is what that reconstruction is based on.
Tell me again.
Priene, Priene. It's in Asia Minor, today's Turkey.
Okay, thank you.
The judges sit in these big chairs right here in the central part, right on the orchestra.
Judges of what?
The judges. Oh, okay. I shouldn't assume that you would know this. Like with athletics or horse racing or foot racing, these dramas are enacted competitively. So you have a number of playwrights, a number of choruses, and each one of these is competing against the others, and one of the plays will win for tragedy, one will win for comedy, and another will win for the Seder play. And the winning team gets the right to set up a big golden tripod in the vicinity of the sanctuary. So, yes, competitive. In this context, here's the altar, right here in the area around where the judges are. So the floor, there you get a close-up. I mean, this is fantastically well preserved. Anyways, you can see the cuttings for setting up the big paintings, as well as the cuttings for the 3 openings for the doors. And there are stone beams, but the floor is wooden. I'll say a little bit more about the reason why the floor is wooden. And this represents the space for the paintings. Got that? Painting. Very important. And here is a reconstruction of, not that one, I think, but another one, but more or less the same idea. A lot of the surviving ones from the late classical period, which is to say the 4th century BC, leading up to the Hellenistic period, well, they're very similar, as you'll see. But we're looking at, this is all Priene down here. We're looking down at Epidaurus. It has a great view, as you can tell. I've been to at least one modern production here at Epidaurus. They're uniformly terrible. Again, the orchestra.
Did they set up a stage when they do
Oh
the
yes,
opera?
they set up a stage, and the stage dominates the center, usually. At Epidaurus, I mean, this all becomes the stage. And they're always super modern stagings. So there's not a trace of ancient Greek anything left in. You have to go to the Getty Villa. Anyhow, this next section is just to remind you that our tradition of theater is post-medieval, and certainly in our part of the world goes back to Elizabethan London and Shakespeare. If you're familiar with any of these, you're more familiar probably with the Globe and its other similar theaters. And the Globe has been reconstructed on, not exactly on its site. In London, you could see Shakespeare's plays in a recreation of the Globe. However, this is a late 18th century, during the French Revolution, painting of the assassination of Julius Caesar. What's striking about this painting, if we think about the stage, is that the drama is represented in depth. Remember I was talking about the narrow ancient stage? Here we are used to seeing drama in depth. And that's why I chose this painting, because you have layers, foreground, middle ground, background. And the painting itself is probably a painting of a stage drama. Now, just after Shakespeare in the Jacobean period, the great architect Inigo Jones, this is a drawing coming out of his studio showing a project for a theater, and this theater has been recreated also in London to represent the continuation of English drama in the 16th and 17th century. Drury Lane, I think is where it is. It's supposed to be the theater. Anyways, there's a section through, it's So if you take a section through the plan looking in both directions, in this direction you look at the audience part, which does resemble the earlier Elizabethan theaters, but then the stage itself is again a stage in depth. And this is a drawing by Indigo Jones showing a painting and a scene from one of the masks that he was the architect, painter in charge of creating for the court of James I and Charles I. So notice again, the center is actually a painting. But the other part of the tradition that is not as well known is that many of Shakespeare's plays, if not virtually all of them, were first performed for the royal court. They weren't performed for a plebeian audience, unlike what you saw in Shakespeare in Love, that rather fallacious movie. And they were performed in the great halls of the palaces. This is a painting of the Great Hall at Hampton Court. So, our tradition of rectangular theaters and rectangular places for performance for music as well really goes back to royal performances in great halls. This is a good example from one of the great spectacles in the French royal court, and so ultimately this leads to the whole stage area seen as a gigantic frame for a three-dimensional painting. So in that sense, we return to some aspect of antiquity, and this is a mask which, believe it or not, borrows the great vista of the great canal at Versailles, receding to the horizon, and foregrounds it and frames it as a part of a theater. Those of you who've been to Versailles would have recognized that immediately. And there's Louis in the center in silhouette. Okay, so why am I going back to the narrowness of the stage and emphasizing the paintings? Well, there's another way in which the narrowness of the stage can be encountered in our surviving artistic, it's a lovely model of late classical stage. And where can it be encountered? In pedimental sculpture. And this is an archaic monument from Delphi, the famous Siphnian treasury, which the friezes in the pedimental sculpture was miraculously well preserved, and this is, you see it set up again in the museum in Delphi. So think about it. Both the frieze and the pediments will both echo and inform the presentation of drama. There's a reconstruction of the treasury. It's the town of Siphnos, which dedicated it on the processional route leading up to the temple. So it's called the Siphnian treasury. There you see the pediment, there's the frieze, and here's a reconstruction in polychromy, which is actually fairly accurate. So notice that the flesh parts are not painted, it's the garment that's painted. The background to the figures is blue, not red. When you see red, you should be skeptical. In the archaic period, much earlier, it was occasionally red, but by the classical period it'll be uniformly blue, and in the transitional period it's also blue.
Michael, the
Yes.
museum in Philadelphia has a similar
Paint, but way too much color in the
Right.
sculpture.
uh,
Yeah, way too much color. Right, the museum in Philadelphia. Now this is a side view of the same treasury, and what most reconstructions leave out is the foreground, the literally hundreds and hundreds of dedications which crowded the sanctuary so much that we have some surviving laws from the sanctuary basically begging people to leave enough room so that people can move about. So imagine an ancient Greek sanctuary, more like a gigantic museum that is so packed with sculptures and other kinds of three-dimensional dedications that you can barely move through it.
What's the definition of the sanctuary here? Like,
A sanctuary is a place set apart as the property of the god, where you, in dedicating something to the god, you give up something precious to yourself. And we'll talk about it in some detail later on. Those of you who go to Washington, D.C. will see a marvelous large-scale reproduction of this great Beaux-Arts painted reconstruction of the sanctuary, and our treasury was right here. I think that's where, yeah, probably right here. Anyhow, what's lovely about this painting is it gives you a sense of the crowds of statues. So the buildings themselves are dedications, but they don't exhaust they're barely just they're basically just the framework for all the other dedications, including colossal statues like this one of Apollo. And most of what we know comes from the statue bases or some descriptions which describe some of the statues that have survived. There's the back part of our treasury, so it has sculpted pediments on both sides because you're going to see it going right. So no, it's actually not that building, but it's that building, and it's looking in that direction. So the front is here, and this is the back. Okay, of course, the most famous pediments are the ones that you can see the remains of in the British Museum, the pediments of the Parthenon, the so-called Elgin marbles. And what they are telling is a story through a series of figures. This is from the famous Carré drawing of them in situ in the late 17th century. After the building had gone kaboom, so the center is missing, but before they were transported to London. And here is, based on the cuttings, plus knowing the subject matter, a reconstruction of what that part of the pediment looked like. It represents the birth of Athena. This is probably a fair supposition for the missing center. As I said, we have the cuttings for the base of the statue. So probably Athena has already emerged out of Zeus's head and is being crowned by a victory, so she occupies the center. You have all the gods of Olympus witnessing this event, but it is framed in a lovely way by, at this end, these horses are the horses of the goddess of dawn. So you see the event framed between morning and evening on the other side. So the receding horses are the goddess of dusk. And there's a small model of the whole. Not bad for an attempt to reconstruct with the whole assemblage, just to give an impression. Anyways, we have pieces of these horses, so we know something of the central. Oh no, it's right. This is the other pediment. This is the, but we do have pieces of these horses. This is the contest between Athena and Poseidon for which god will become the principal god of Attica. She wins, which is why her olive tree dominates the center here. And there are more surviving fragments of this pediment. So this is probably a more accurate reconstruction of that composition. There's a very good book written about these pediments, which gives you a whole history of, and I'll send you a link to the book, which is probably the best introduction to Greek pedimental sculpture by I forget her name, but it'll be there. Anyways, this is obviously a very big model. This is the Parthenon at Nashville, reconstructed to scale. They really do have to fix this up. They have to make the background a light blue and the triglyphs a dark blue. But otherwise, it's nice to see an attempt to reconstruct the pediment at a large scale. There's a good drawing of the west pediment. And again, what is good about this drawing, not just that it includes the acroteria, the corner acroteria and the crowning acroterion, but it includes some of the known dedications framing the monument. Now, a fair bit is missing. We have cuttings to show that there was a statue in front of every one of the columns. So many more dedications than are shown in the drawing, but at least it's a step in the right direction. Okay, so back to theaters and the narrow stage. Okay, so acoustics. The actors are speaking through a mask. If they are going to be heard, they have to speak directly to the audience. They can't face each other and have a conversation. There's no tete-a-tete, as it were. So the challenge of presenting a Greek play where you have 3 actors plus a chorus, and probably the chorus is not down here, but is in fact either right below, depending on the drama, or actually sharing the stage with the actors, is you have a de facto 6-3+6 situation of the number of bodies more or less as you would see on a pediment. So how do you relate a story when most of the people are facing straight ahead? You can only do it through very ritualized gestures that are culturally recognizable. Just to give you a little bit of a context, here's a lovely German model from Berlin reconstructing the center of Priene, where you see the stage, the Temple of Athena, the Agora just below, the stadium, the gymnasium, and something of the town. Priene was excavated by the Germans in the late 19th century and is very well known thanks to the German publications, and a part of the characteristic or the representative fragments can be seen in the Berlin Museum, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, and this is a little sanctuary to Zeus. There's a lovely drawing, the best reproduction I could find online of Priene. It had fortification walls that had to take in this big rock, otherwise if these fortification walls would not have been useful. Okay, so this is not Priene. This is Eretria in the northeastern Peloponnese, but again, showing a typical late classical theater where what you see is, as it develops, the backstage gets bigger. But the actual stage remains fairly narrow, and you again have room for painted scenery below and above. So, from this is from Oropos in Attica. Again, lots of fragments of this theater have survived, including a lot of this building. So we even know that the central part was framed with the beams returning here to emphasize the central painting and the side paintings. Well, there's the plan of the same. I've been to the sanctuary.
Do any of the paintings survive?
Only in Roman wall painting.
Were they changed for each play, or did they?
Yes, that's the point. Each play, as a part of the production team, you would have painters, and they would be painting very big paintings. And so the driving force for the development of realism in Greek monumental painting is drama. So what we see in monumental art, such as pediments and friezes from the classical period on, is a reflection of this. But most of the evidence is missing, except for the so-called paintings of Pompeii, which are basically high-end wallpaper on
I have a
walls.
question about that.
Yes.
So did they view that differently? Like these like scenic paintings, were these like high art as compared to like decorative art? Do we know this kind of stuff? Like for the
The same people who did the high art did the decorative art.
So it's all fairly high art.
Yes.
Yes.
Right, of course, because these stage productions are gifts to the gods in
Yeah.
sanctuaries. There's no low art.
Right. Including
It's all
the wall
sacred art.
paintings.
Well,
In-
except until we get to the Romans.
Okay.
And we can talk about that later. Let me just finish with the... Okay, we're back to the... Now, country theaters, of course, would have very temporary seating, still representing the earliest form of the theater, and little wooden stage buildings. These are represented in these vases, which mostly come from Italy, from southern Italy, Apulia, and other places. And what's nice is you see the stairs. You see a little bit of a drama enacted. This is clearly a comedy. This is not. This is a tragedy. More serious. This is also from a tragedy. Well, actually, it's from a farce, but a farce that mimics a tragedy. And the clue is the door here, and the fact that here you have a god. This is Athena, who's being supplicated by these strange people. Again, a comic scene. And notice they all have masks. This could represent it's the birth of a god. Could be Dionysus. Not sure. Anyhow. Now, eventually, this becomes the basis for the Roman theater. And the Roman stage, rather than being painted, is a monumental stage in bronze and stone and statuary and architecture representing a palace. So you still have the three doors. Here's a 3D view of the same. This is from the Roman theater at Orange in southern France, for which a lot of the stage building and its fragments survives to allow us to recreate it to a fair degree. Now, even though the Roman stage, this and this will be wood. So it's not enough, the masks are not enough. Just to say a little bit about acoustics, you need to have, essentially the stage building is in part the musical instrument. So it's the resonating box that allows the voices to be amplified, which is why ultimately even today wooden theaters with plaster are far more preferable to masonry interiors, which don't contribute to the acoustics. These are a couple of vases that represent known plays. This is the Bacchae by Euripides, where the poor guy's been pulled apart by his mother and people who don't know who he is because they're in a state of, let's just say, not knowing what they're doing. This is a representation of Oedipus meeting the Sphinx and correctly answering those three key questions. So, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. This is a representation of Electra. There's several Electras. This could be based on the Sophocles one. Here she's sitting by the tomb. This is a tomb. You see the ribbon. Don't forget the ribbon. We're going to meet the ribbon. These are not snakes. These are ribbons. This is the representation of another play. I've forgotten which one this is. This could also be Electra. No, this is Medea. So I'm wrong. This is Medea, who's contemplating her dire deed of doing in all her children to get revenge on her husband. And this is Medea, and you see her in the form of the sorceress here. That's probably what that is. Now, glimpses into this world do come mostly from the surviving frescoes and paintings of Pompeii. Now, Pompeii was a city of rich upper-class people, but not patricians. But they were mimicking the aristocratic class of Rome. And so what you see in Pompeii are echoes of what you would have seen on the walls of the houses of the rulers, of the great patricians, the senators, etc., in the city of Rome. So on the walls of Pompeii you have frescoes. They're not actually, strictly speaking, frescoes. They're wax encaustic on plaster. Otherwise he would have survived better if they were true fresco. But what they are paintings of walls that would have had actual great paintings in the great houses of Rome. So again, it's an echo of something that we don't have a direct surviving piece of. Likewise with these mosaics. So fantastic as they are, they're only, they're like a reproduction of the Mona Lisa or another painting in some middle-class home. Oh, sorry. Anyhow, okay, now, to get a sense of the quality of ancient Greek theater, you have to go to Japan. And specifically for the farces, kabuki theater, for the more popular plays, but for the high-end tragedies, the No plays. And here's a photograph of a No stage with the No play underway. So you have musicians, you have actors, you have elaborate costumes, and all the actors have various masks. And it's actually hard to get a DVD of this kind of drama. They're not readily available. Although, we are in New York. So on 6th Avenue, across from the park behind the New York Public Library, is a Japanese bookstore. And I believe they're very expensive, something like $60, but you could get a DVD of a No play there.
Every now and then there are new productions.
Pardon?
Every now and then.
They are in New York? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Sometimes like through the Japan Society.
Oh.
They do a lot of theater at the Japan Society.
Okay, well, I need to look into that because I'd love to see a No play.
It's really slow.
Well, the very strangeness of them is important for us to get a better sense of how unfamiliar a Greek drama really would appear if we saw it reenacted accurately rather than one of these modern versions.
The myths in them are really amazing. I have a copy of a few No plays, like just the scripts.
Oh, okay.
But not the DVDs.
Right. Oh, excellent. Well, I'll see what I can do on the internet, and maybe I can get a fragment or two from some video thing that's available on YouTube. I'll send it to you. Okay, so this, by the way, is a representation of the young Zeus. How do you know it's Zeus? Because he has his thunderbolts right there. Okay, again, just an echo of an echo, but here we have Zeus as Jupiter with Achilles' mother supplicating him to change her son's fate, and of course Jupiter will not budge, and it's a spectacular painting by Ingres. It was his graduation piece from his stay at the French school, the École in Rome. Anyhow, so why did I juxtapose these two? Probably some of the great paintings of Greek antiquity were not that far from this. And in fact, it's very likely that Ingres himself was using what he saw in Pompeii in the early 19th century and in various fragments in Rome to recreate an ancient painting. So, how are we doing for time?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the end of my Dionysus section, and to be continued. Next week, just a glimpse at one of the best preserved high-end vases from Greek antiquity. So this is a miraculous survival. This is from a town in northern Greece, Derveni. So it's called the Derveni crater, and you can see it in the museum in Thessaloniki. This gives a glimpse of the art that we've lost.
That's so depressing.
And the miracle part,
In which museum is it?
Thessaloniki. It's the Derveni crater. Crater is the name of the form. And the ashes of the deceased were placed in this extraordinary work of metallic art.
Is it bronze? What is it?
It's bronze with
Gold.
gilding and silver but yeah, it's a special alloy of bronze, and yeah, we can end on this, but remember this color. This is probably akin to what's known as Corinthian bronze. So not all bronze statues or bronze artifacts were of the bronze that we're more familiar with that tends towards black or a greenish black. They also had the golden sheen, and some of the alloys actually do use silver and gold in the alloy as well. The thing about gold in the alloy is that it tends to migrate to the surface over time, and so it would create a kind of gold version of fresco. In other words, the gilding would be in the alloy rather than sitting on the surface of the alloy.
Oh, that's
And we
really
know that the
cool.
giant bronze Athena on the Acropolis had this golden alloy because a part of her, a fragment of an inscription which describes what she's made of, survived, and it explicitly mentions the gold.
So it would have appeared gold, but it
Yes.
would have been bronze.
Yeah, with a golden sheen. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Okay, so to be continued.
Michael, I just had a question about
Yes.
the theatre. The Festival of Dionysus was once a year, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So in all of these theatres around
Yes.
the Mediterranean, it was at the same time, or they were different?
Well, different cities had different calendars, so it would be at the time of the festival, but it wouldn't necessarily be at exactly the same time of year.
It was-
Dionysus is a traveling god, and he is known to appear in different cities at different times. So,
Yeah. Okay.
but in Athens, it was always the same time of year.
And that was it lasted for like a few days.
So it lasted for about a week or so.
Yeah.
I mean, you have many plays that are being performed.
Yeah.
One after the other after the other. And of course, they're performed in the middle of the day. There's no artificial lighting. This is open to the sky. But for you painters,
Yeah.
there was a lot of work back then.
So about the narrow space, is there any other reason other than that they were sort of
Well,
representing it was like a
probably the
echo?
principal reason is acoustics.
Right. Okay.
They need the stage building because they need the resonating
Right.
chamber, and the actors have to speak directly to the audience.
Right.
So there's
So
no,
there's
the
no
depth
need.
is created through the painting.
Yeah. That's really
Oh.
interesting.
It's not like they're like props.
So it was
Right.
it was
Yeah, yeah,
illusionistic.
yeah.
Yes, illusionistic perspectival painting,
Yeah.
which goes back to the 5th century BC
I'm really
in Athens.
When I was in Italy, I won the Alma Shapiro in 2013.
Oh, wow.
So I was there. I was in Rome for 3 months, and then my husband and I stayed for 8 months altogether, and one of the most influential parts of my entire stay were the wall paintings in Rome, in the Plaza
Right,
Massimo,
okay,
but
right,
also
right.
in
Well, some of
Naples.
those paintings are paintings of famous classical paintings.
Yeah,
And much of the Roman field of art history and painting is trying to get clues as to which painting in Pompeii might be an echo of a famous Apelles or, one of the other well-known names based on surviving descriptions or hints of this or that painting.
yeah,
But the Alexander mosaic is probably the most famous
yeah.
replica of an
Yeah,
ancient
those are
painting.
just like even the decorative paintings and just they're so endlessly fascinating to look at.
Yeah.
And just like the little small like portraits that are only like this big that are
Right.
just making up all of these different they're so beautifully painted and really incredibly preserved actually. Like
Yeah, just remember, even the best preserved ones were missing a lot of the surface.
yeah.
And because it's encaustic, it's like oil paint, only
Right.
less resilient. So the surface tends to flake away.
Yeah.
And so many of them really have the quality of Leonardo da Vinci's
Oh, they
Last
totally
Supper.
do, but it makes
Yeah.
it really beautiful too,
Yeah.
and really interesting for a painter
Right.
to be able to see
To
them.
envisage what the whole must have looked like
Yeah.
based on the traces.
Yeah.
Plus, you occasionally get glimpses where you have a patch that's well preserved so that you can
Right.
get a sense of all the missing layers.
Yeah, yeah. The Livia's Garden is.
Oh, those are stunning.
One of my,
Yeah. But that's a good example because not every wall is the same set of preservation.
Oh, it's
So some
very
of them look
different.
like underpaintings, which
Yeah.
is what they
Some
are.
of them are
And then
really
you just get patches of
Mhm.
better preserved
Yeah, and
surfaces.
then there are just
Yeah.
some like pieces of fruit that are like
Yeah.
way thicker
Yeah.
than the Palazzo Massimo. That was my favorite museum in Rome.
Yeah, it's fabulous, especially the third floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's so amazing. So yeah, so I'm just interested because there's nothing. We don't really have any Greek paintings, so we only have these Roman wall paintings really, and I just couldn't. And it's so different seeing them in person because they're really they're so vibrant.
Right, the
Even,
colors,
and-
exactly. The reproduction can be very misleading. Reproductions in books.
Oh yeah.
They're
Well,
the
ones-
freshness of the
The ones you
colors.
showed from Augustus's house on the Palatine,
Right.
like those in person, like that red is unbelievable to
Right.
see that, and just like the architectural renderings and that whole.
So you actually got to see the House of Augustus?
Yeah, it was open.
Right, it was only open for about a year, so you were lucky. It's closed again.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Oh, Lydia's house in the Forum was closed when I was there, so you
Right.
couldn't go in there, but you could go in Augustus.
Ah, yeah, well, they're
Yeah.
both closed now,
Oh darn.
sadly. You need to
Yeah.
know people who know people,
Yeah.
which you can do at the American
Yeah.
Academy,
it's
at the American Academy. So.
Yeah, it was really. We got to go into the with the academy. We got to go into the whatever it's like the basement of the Coliseum. Like,
Oh, wow.
structures.
Oh,
That
fantastic.
was
Great.
really, really
The
amazing.
substructures, yeah.
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 So that was
Okay, well, thanks for coming. And